close off this series of readings, I want to give an abridged version of Joseph Francois Lafitau's chapter on indigenous languages, because I think it's kind of interesting and also kind of entertaining, after which I'll give a bit of commentary about the things I found interesting or entertaining. Not only do the American languages have no analogy with the Hebraic language, the Oriental, Greek, and Latin languages, and all those which pass as learned, but neither do they have any with the modern European languages and the others known to us. Every barbarous language is extremely difficult to teach a man who speaks another with a totally different structure. He would not be able to succeed by himself without extreme application and several years of practice. It would even be said that he will never know it except very imperfectly if he is not helped, and has not the talent of supplementing the lack of books by devising a method for himself to smooth out the difficulties and shorten the road. When two peoples who speak languages so far apart as Iroquois and French meet for the needs of trade or for their common defense, they are forced equally on both sides to approach each other in their own language to be able to understand each other. The beginnings are quite difficult, but in the end, with a little practice, they succeed in communicating their thoughts to each other, partly by gestures, partly by certain corrupt words which are of neither language because they are corrupted, forming a speech without rhyme or reason, but which serves to bring them to the goal which they propose. There has been formed in this way in Canada, on the American islands, and in various other countries a jargon whose vocabulary is very short, and which deals only with trade. There are in it words taken from the languages of all the tribes with whom the French have had communication. One tense is used for another, a third person for a first, a plural for a singular. Anything is good. Gesture, the presence of the object referred to, and usage render intelligible a speech in itself unintelligible. The Frenchman believes that he is speaking the language of the Indian that he is speaking that of the Frenchman, and that they understand each other well enough for their needs. During the first months of my stay at the Sault Ste. Louis, the Indians spoke this jargon to me, and they supposed that, being French, I would understand. But I understood it so little that the moment I began to see a little clearly into the principles of their natural language, I had to tell them to speak as they do between Indians. Then I understood their thought much better. In South America there is a universal language, current everywhere, and elsewhere understood, as the Malaysian language is in India. Besides that, each individual nation has its own, different from that of the others, and there is such a large number of them that people think that, in the neighborhood of the Amazon River alone, there must be almost 70 different dialects. Besides that, it must be remarked that amongst all the tribes, there are properly 3 of them, the one suitable for council style, so noble and obscure that often they themselves do not understand what is being said; the second, that peculiar to men; the third, to women. In North America, all the languages of its inhabitants, except Sioux and some others not very well known to us beyond the Mississippi, can be traced back to 2 mother tongues, Algonquian and Huron. These are subdivided into as many dialects as there are individual tribes. When I say that Algonquian and Huron are the mother tongues, I speak according to a common idea, for amongst so many languages which are very closely connected amongst themselves, it would be difficult, not to say impossible, to distinguish the original languages from the dialects. Although there are scarcely any more true Algonquins than Iroquois, and brandy has almost entirely destroyed them, Algonquian is, nevertheless, the language of the tribes from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi. Huron was formerly very extensively used. Father Brebeuf counted about 30,000 souls of true Hurons distributed in 20 villages of the tribe. There were besides 12 sedentary and populous tribes who spoke their language. Most of these tribes no longer exist. The Iroquois have destroyed them. The true Hurons are reduced today to the small mission of Lorette near Quebec, where Christianity can be seen to flourish with the encouragement of the French. The 5 Iroquois nations form as many different dialects of the Huron language. They are all almost as distinct from each other as French, Spanish, and Italian, some more so and others less, in proportion and according to their situation. The Huron language is noble, majestic, and more regular than the Iroquois dialects. Its pronunciation is rude, very guttural, and its accent difficult to get. The accent is what foreigners do not catch very easily. Our missionaries, however, had a man who had been a servant of the Huron who, although he had never been able to learn the language during several years of stay with them, had nevertheless made for himself a kind of jargon to divert himself. It meant nothing, but the imitation of the Huron accent was so well imitated with the endings of the most ordinary words, that the Hurons themselves were deceived by it and said, We see quite well that he is speaking our language, but we cannot understand what he is saying. The language of the Onondaga Indians is nearest Huron in accent and word endings, and, for this reason, is more highly esteemed than the others. In pronouncing it, there is a sort of cadence and whispering sound which is not disagreeable. The language of the Mohawk is softer and less guttural. It has at most only some fine aspirations, and those barely perceptible. Oneida seems to have been composed from Mohawk. There is, in pronouncing it, a sort of delicacy. To soften it, they changed the letter R into L and cut off half of the word so that the last syllable must be guessed at. This affected delicacy is, however, disagreeable, and the tone with which they utter it somewhat displeasing. Cayuga and Seneca are crude, especially Seneca. The other Iroquois make fun of these tribes and say they speak badly. The French themselves call them the peasantry because the grossness of their language makes itself felt through the whole person. Still, Father Carheil, who has learned their language after working a great deal on Huron and the other Iroquoian languages, finds it the most energetic and richest of all. All these languages are living and subject to change. New words appear in them, others lose favor and become obsolete. Everyone flatters himself that he speaks his language well and likes to make fun of those who speak it badly. They respect foreigners, however, especially the Europeans whom they regard as incapable of learning it, except the missionaries who, they think, should know it as they do, because since they have the help of the Scriptures, in which they believe that all is written, and that, since it is their profession to apply themselves to language, it is their fault that they speak it badly. Most of these Western peoples, although with very different tongues, have almost the same distinctive character, the same way of thinking and tricks of expression. But just as these languages lack a great number of terms to express the knowledge given us by the arts, so they also have a greater lack of expressions connected with our ideas of religion, so that the missionaries who have had to clarify these languages have apparently had to swallow insurmountable difficulties not only to learn the words for things of common use which occur frequently in conversation, but they've had to make a more individual and much more painful study to draw from the very depths of these languages, as it were, a new language which serves to make known to the Indians matters pertaining to God and abstract truths. And although this new language does not consist of words forged and grafted on, but only paraphrases and compounds made on the basis with the turns of their language, which they understand easily, it has been, however, very difficult to arrive at it, and the Europeans who have lived among them many years and learned their language in childhood avow ingenuously that they would not know how to tell them of God and instruct them as the missionaries do, although they understand from elsewhere all that the missionaries say. Father Biard expresses himself on this subject in a very pleasing manner, and I think that it will not be disagreeable to the reader for me to quote him here. The Jesuits, he says, seeing that the language was absolutely necessary to them for conversion of the Indians, resolved to set themselves to learning it with all diligence. But one could not believe the great difficulties which they met in it, by the fact principally that they had no interpreters or teachers. Mr. de Biencourt and some others knew a little about it, enough for barter and for common affairs. But when it was a question of talking of God and of religious matters, there was the great jump. There the headland, which said no. Therefore they were constrained to learn the language by inquiring of the Indians the name for each thing, and the task was less painful when the word sought was for something which could be touched and shown to the eye, a stone, a river, a house, to strike, to jump, to laugh, to sit down. But as for terms for the inner and spiritual actions which cannot be shown to the senses, and words which are called abstract and universal, such as to believe, to doubt, to hope, to talk, to fear, a being, a body, a substance, a spirit, virtue, vice, sin, right, justice, etc., for these it was necessary to pant and sweat. In bringing them to light, the missionaries suffered childbirth pains. Since they did not know where to take hold, they made more than 100 attempts. There was no gesture which expressed their conception sufficiently clearly, and thus they used more than 1,000. Our gentlemen, the Indians, however, amused themselves, made great fun of them, always making jests, and in order that the mockery should still be more profitable, if you had your pen and paper to write, it was necessary that they should have their plates filled and their napkins under them, for the good oracles only come to help at such a tripod. Enough of that. Both Apollo and Mercury failed them. Then they grew angry and went away, if one wished to retain them a little longer. I have quoted at full length the Father's words to make more intelligible the admirable assurance of Baron La Hontan, who having given us at the conclusion of his memoirs a Huron dictionary composed of 50 words, the greater part of which are mangled, does not hesitate a moment in supposing a great lengthy dialogue between himself and a Huron on the subject of religion. I doubt that even after a 30 years' stay among the Huron he would have been capable of answering his Indian, even had it been true that the Indian was capable of the reasonings which he has him utter, which are, certainly only his own. His kind of Algonquian dictionary, although longer, is no more accurate. But by the use of those words, which someone may, doubtless, have had written out for him, he thought that he could persuade the public that he knew the languages and customs of the Indians perfectly, while, on the other hand, he had enough confidence to get it into his head that the same public would believe him when he said that the priests and missionaries who had grown old among the Indians did not know the meaning of a word so much used and so trivial that there is not even one of the French-Canadian children who does not know it. The reason for the great difficulty which the missionaries had at first in being able to learn the Indian languages is that they made the same mistake about this as they did about their customs. They wanted to judge it by our manners and usages, so that, seeing them without fixed rules such as we have for religious and civil government, they thought them without religion, laws, or any form of republic. In the same way, they wanted to judge their languages by the European ones, and as they had not penetrated into their heart, they kept imagining, as Father LeJeune wrote, that all terms of piety, devotion, and virtue, and all those used to express the good things of another life, the language of theologians, philosophers, mathematicians, doctors, in a word, of all learned men, all words concerning the regulation and government of a city, a province, or an empire, all that touches justice, recompense, punishment, the names of an infinite number of arts which exist in our Europe, of a countless number of flowers, trees, fruits, an infinite number of animals, thousands upon thousands of contrivances, beauties, and riches, that all that, I say, existed neither in the thought nor mouth of the Indians, who had no religion, no knowledge of virtue, no administration, no kingdom, no republic, no science, nor anything that I have just mentioned, and consequently, that all the names and words which refer to this world of goodness and grandeur must be lacking to their vocabulary. Although there is some truth in this, and lack of words on the one hand and ignorance of many things on the other must make their languages less rich than ours, still, this poverty of terms is not nearly so great as the Father says. But on the basis of this error, which he makes in common with others who have arrived at the same conclusion, is his slight knowledge of the construction of Indian languages, which is very different from that of the European ones. Of the two parts of speech noted by Aristotle, Huron and Iroquois, of which I am principally speaking here, for I do not know the others, have only the verb which dominates all through the language. Thus, there are no substantive nouns or adjectives, no declensions, no cases, no articles. That is, in itself, a cutting down of more than one half on our languages. After that, one should not be surprised by the astonishment of our missionaries who expected to find, and did not find at all, in these American languages a quantity of proper nouns, abstract, general, particular, individual, derived, diminutive, argumentative, in a word, everything which, in European languages, is found to be of the nature of the noun and depends on it. Language is, in a sense, a purely arbitrary thing, and the words of which it is composed are only signs adopted to represent the things to which they have been attached, signifying nothing alone. That is to say that, in themselves, they are indifferent, insofar as meaning one thing or another is concerned. Just as the figures and designs, which are the images and representations of terms, have no meaning or value except insofar as it is agreed that they have such a meaning. In this way, languages can be multiplied to as many as there are nations, and they could be so entirely different from each other that there would not be a single word or expression with the same meaning in two languages, except through pure chance or the communication between nations which could have adopted some words through commercial relations. But on the other hand, since language was instituted to express our thoughts, and has an essential connection with the operations of the soul and the objects on which our thoughts turn, to affirm or deny, in a word, to pronounce, and make explanations on what is suitable or unsuitable for them, it is necessary for the bonds of society, for trade and the communication of our ideas, which are everywhere almost the same for all men, and have the same objects everywhere. It is necessary, I say, that every language have, like ours, some nouns of different kinds, adjectives, substantives, etc., and in these nouns, numbers, genders, and cases, active verbs, passive, neutral, etc., and in these verbs, tenses, and moods, first, second, and third persons, finally adverbs, conjugations, prepositions, and other particles, which serve to join discourse, assemble words, and make the sense complete. Or indeed, it is necessary for there to be an equivalent which can furnish as many signs as are needed to supply the lack of different parts of speech, which, since they are in one language found in which they are lacking, defective, if it did not have in its structure something to fulfill the end and goal of all language, which consists in such a communication of our thoughts, there is nothing on which we cannot speak and reason. Huron and Iroquois have properly only verbs which form their base, so that everything is conjugated and nothing is declined. But in these verbs there is an admirable artfulness which replaces all the rest. It is this malleability which makes all the economy of these languages, which have their beauties like ours. But as there is no perfect language, they have also, with their regularities, their irregularities, which make them difficult and thorny. I should have given much more willingly an idea of some one of these languages to show their structure than anyone has done up till now, since most travelers have contented themselves with giving some imperfect vocabularies, consisting of a few deformed words which are most in common use. But I reflected that an abridged treatment would be too imperfect, and that on the other hand I cannot treat the subject at length without overwhelming the reader with a multitude of barbarous terms which would be disagreeable to the public, with which these foreign languages have very little relation, from which the scholars themselves cannot gain much enlightenment, and which can at most have no other effect than to show that these languages are very far from those known to us, that they are rich in spite of the poverty attributed to them, and that, although they have a different structure from our own, they have great beauties. So now I want to pick out a couple of things from some of the pages and talk about them, things I found interesting or amusing or whatever. On this page he's talking about the difficulty of learning the languages. You're not going to get anywhere unless you got help and you're putting in a lot of effort and practice. And that most of the traders and stuff who are coming over, they're not actually learning the languages. They're not able or willing to put in the necessary effort. They're just coming up with a sort of weird Creole. You find references to these like really niche Creoles and pidgin languages that existed during the fur trade days. I remember reading about one in sort of Western Canada, and it had like Cree verbs and French nouns with English grammar. He also talks about how people sort of think they've learned the language, but then on the other side is basically just gibberish and noise. And that puts me in the mind of sort of a philosophy essay I read a long time ago where it was talking about like, how can you ever be really sure that you're understood? I'm narrating this thing out, and I'm pretty sure that you're all going to understand me, at least those of you who speak English to a decent degree. What if I'm actually just making a load of noise and I don't get to know that I'm just making noise because the only feedback I get is people who are saying, oh yeah, absolutely, 100%, certainly. Because nobody out there wants to sort of identify themselves as not speaking English very well, so we're both out here just making noise and not understanding each other. We're all just out here pretending that we know how to communicate with each other, and because we're all pretending the same thing, we sort of are able to communicate. This page, I'm kind of amused by his anecdote. I remember a video on YouTube. It was something like what English sounds to foreigners, and it was like a shepherd in, I don't know, maybe the Middle East somewhere, Turkey or whatever. He must have watched like a lot of American movies or listened to American radio or something, because he could do like a spot-on American accent, but the words he was saying were like mostly not words, mostly like gibberish with some like English words thrown in. It was just fascinating, and this put me in mind of it. Gave me a chuckle whether or not it's true. So this one, he's talking about some of the difficulties in missionary work with regards to these languages that express things very differently from French. He's talking about how they're getting around these limitations by generating new compound words, which is a feature of polysynthetic languages broadly. You can generate compound words very easily. For instance, let's say that I want to talk about spirit in the Christian sense and I can't find a word that approximates it. If I have a decent grasp of the language, I can generate a new compound word on the fly to sort of circumlocute. Gawaradoganti, holy breath. Sauradoganti, your holy breath. I didn't pull that out of a book. That's a word I just made up out of 3 components. The whole language sort of functions like this. It's very metaphorical. And because it's so metaphorical, it's very easy for people who speak the language to grasp new metaphors. If you think somebody's understood your metaphor, you can then use it to ask, oh, how do you say this more properly? And if there's no better word, you can just stick with your metaphor. Also on this page, just because it amuses me, I want to highlight his opinions on the sounds of the languages. He likes Huron and Mohawk, obviously, because these are the two that he speaks to a certain degree. He likes Onondaga, even though he doesn't understand it, just based on the sounds of it. He thinks Oneida is annoying, I'm assuming because it's basically like Mohawk, but harder for him to understand. And then the absolute slander of Cayuga and Seneca. Man, Cayuga is crude, but boy, you haven't seen crude until you've heard Seneca. Like, holy cow. The grossness of their language makes itself felt throughout the whole person, and all the other tribes make fun of them and say that they speak badly. This just tickled me. The other bit that tickled me is they respect foreigners who they regard as incapable of learning it. Oh yeah, you guys don't speak our language. We respect you for trying even if you're failing miserably. Good on you, keep up the good work. But they have no patience whatsoever for the missionaries because the missionaries, they got the Bible, and the Bible's supposed to contain the sum of all human knowledge. And besides, it's their job to be out here speaking the language. They're supposed to be conveying these high-level ideas, and here they are out here speaking like toddlers. Like, get your act together, man. Holy heck. This is a dereliction of duty. You're not able to do your job right if you're not able to speak the language, so don't come out here pretending to teach us about all of these sacred truths when you can't even express them. Like, holy cow. So on this page, I want to draw attention to Lafitau's criticism of a fellow called Baron Lahontan. Lahontan is most notable these days for having recorded the speeches of a Wendat fellow called Gondiadonk. These speeches are made popular through a modern book by David Graeber called The Dawn of Everything. The speeches are really powerful and you should read them. He's basically looking at European society and saying, how can you people live like this? Lafitau is looking at the dictionary provided by Lahontan and saying, this dictionary is so bad that I don't believe you spoke this language to any meaningful degree. You couldn't possibly have understood this speech, even if it was what this fellow was actually saying. Basically just accusing Lahontan of making up the speeches just to sort of, put a different spin on his own voice. Very interesting. On this page, he's basically calling out previous Jesuit writers for oversimplifying indigenous language, for failing to examine the language in its own terms, for passing judgment on something that they haven't fully understood yet. Basically, Lafitau is calling out these previous Jesuits for being racist, which is really weird to encounter in somebody who published in the 1720s. On this page, he's talking about the weakness of Iroquoian languages with regards to nouns, their strength regarding verbs. In Mohawk, there are very few true nouns. What there are instead are verbs that function as nouns, verbs that function as adjectives. To give a couple of examples, gakunya snore. This word means microwave. But this isn't a noun, it's a verb. What it breaks down to literally is, it cooks food quickly, a habitual tense verb. Or wanheyun ducks, turkey vulture. Literally, it eats dead things. So the Mohawk language, it might be quite a bit poorer than English in terms of like proper true nouns, but it sort of gets around this to a large extent by being dramatically more flexible than English with regards to verbs. It can make verbs that function as nouns. So the final thing he brings up on this page is that, like, hey, we're all human here. We all have the same sort of emotions and sort of desires and drives and spirit. Obviously, pagans are still capable of falling in love, and living in a society, they would want to be able to express this to other people. Your inability to find a word that expresses this doesn't necessarily reflect on their ability to conceptualize things. It might just reflect on your inability with their language. Like, he's calling out his fellow Jesuits again and saying, look, yeah, their language, it isn't as good as French, but like, this is a you problem, bro. Like, get good and stop writing about stuff you don't understand. Like, here's this Jesuit calling out other Jesuits for being racist. It's really refreshing. So that's all I really wanted to talk about with regards to this text. I hope you found this sort of interesting. I know it's a little bit weird.